Hello and welcome to today's Delta Credit Tip. So you didn't watch my video about STDs and FICOs. You didn't watch my video about talking about the budget. Now you are getting phone calls about your spouse's debts that went to debt collectors. What are the parameters around spousal debt? Can debt collectors come after you for it? What are the rules? What are the regulations? Well, stay tuned. We'll tell you on today's Delta Credit Tip. Hello and welcome back to today's Delta Credit Tip. So like I mentioned, you didn't happen to watch any of my videos about talking about your spouse, about the debts that they came into your relationship with. And now the way you find out about it is that a debt collector's called you trying to collect a debt. Are you responsible for this debt of your spouse? Well, let's talk about that, because actually this becomes a very complicated subject. Okay? There's a lot of federal laws involved. There's a lot of state laws involved. So today I'm really going to encourage, if you've got questions or you've got comments that you want to get clarity on, put those down below. This is not a very easy subject. It's not as cut and dry as maybe a Google answer might get you. Okay? So communicate with us. We'll try to communicate with you as best as we possibly can, so we can answer any questions you may have on, am I really responsible or not? Okay? So when we start talking about spousal debt, there's a lot of things that come into play. And under normal circumstances, outside of a courtroom, normally whoever was contractually obligated to a debt is the person that is going to be responsible. So if I have a credit card and I decide later on I want to get married, my spouse is not responsible for that, primarily because she didn't really sign up for that credit card. Just like if I am married with my spouse and our child goes to the hospital, it's my insurance that covers the child, but my spouse takes the child to the hospital. Even though it's my insurance that covers the expense of the hospital visit, if there's a deductible or some sort of copay or some sort of deficiency in what was paid the hospital, well, my spouse would be responsible for that because she was the one that signed for consent of services. So under normal circumstances, that's kind of the golden rule. They who are on contract is who is responsible for that debt. But again, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. The first thing that might complicate that is when you start talking about community property. Okay, there are about 9 different states that have community property. There's like Texas, Arizona, Idaho, Mexico, Wisconsin, California, Louisiana, Nevada. There's several states that have what they call community property states. So if you're married, your assets are shared as community property between the two of you. This extends to debt as well. Okay, so if you accumulate debt together, even though it may only be in one person's name, that spouse shares in that responsibility of that community debt. So if you happen to live in one of those states or not, just still you want to research that before you start making any claims about how you're not responsible for something if you happen to live in a community state. Okay? Now, I am in the state of Florida. The state of Florida is not a community property state. What Florida is an equitable distribution state. So if in the course of getting divorced, let's say, okay, we will share assets equally for the most part, right? But we'll also share the debts in the same way. Now, caveat to that, just because the judge says you're responsible for a debt the debt collector doesn't care. We've got videos on divorce and debt, and you're going to want to make sure you watch those videos as well in those divorce kind of situations. But that's what a court says that you're responsible for, not what the debt collector can claim you're responsible for. Okay? So you got to look at both community property states and you've got to look at equitable distribution states to make sure that you're not going to be responsible for a spouse's mishaps on old debt. Now, there's one thing that you can do to protect your assets. There's actually several things that you can do to protect your assets, but the one in particular that I want to talk about is how you title your assets. So you've got a nice big nest egg at the bank. How you title that account matters. Don't just sign your name. For instance, if you have tenancy in the entirety as part of the title of ownership, what that does is that introduces a third party into it, a kind of an entity. So you've got spouse one, spouse two, and then you've got tenancy in the entirety in the middle. And what that does is it separates the two from being responsible. So in other words, if I have a debt and we share an asset, they can't split it out. It's one asset. It belongs to us jointly. So they can't come after that asset that we own jointly. So when it comes to, taking things from you to satisfy the debt that you weren't originally responsible for, that title of ownership can protect you even in those states like the community property and, of course, in the equitable distribution states like the state of Florida. Okay. Also, going even deeper into that, let's say you have a checking account together and one of you decides you want to have a credit card and that credit card defaults. If that credit card, let's just choose a bank at random that doesn't exist. Let's say Bank of Michael, right? So you go to Bank of Michael and you open up a credit card and you have a joint checking account and the credit card defaults. Well, Bank of Michael can do what they call a right of offset and take that money out of your joint checking account. Only one person's responsible, but because it's with the same institution, they can exercise a right of offset and just take the money. And they don't need to ask you. They can just take it. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the whole idea of what am I responsible for and what I'm not, the other side to this is, well, what can a debt collector do? Can they really come after me for this money and harass me about this when it's not my debt? And the answer is no. Okay, so a debt collector, especially when it comes to state law, so in the state of Florida, a debt collector does have the right to call you, but then you have to start fighting what the federal law says, because the federal law says they can contact you to kind of find you, but they really can't harass you about the debt. So there's a fine line there, but by and large, no, debt collectors are not allowed to start calling and harassing your employer. They're not allowed to call your spouses. They're not allowed to leave messages randomly on machines saying that they're a debt collector calling you for about a debt. They need to have some sort of privacy when it comes to that. And all that is not in the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's more in the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. And again, there's both federal and state versions of this. Okay, so like I said, this is not a very clean cut, clear, no, they can't call you ever kind of situations. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of, again, state and federal kind of conflicts that almost seem to come into play, even though the federal law seems to always trump. Okay, so I know this is not exactly a clear-cut answer, but the reason why I wanted to go ahead and deliver it is because it's a very common issue, right? And we want to know that, okay, well, what laws really do exist for me? And I don't want to go on blanket hype that I hear on the internet. It's just not that cut and dry. My suggestion, if you have an issue where you're being confronted by a debt collector and you're not quite sure if you're legally responsible because it's a spousal debt, give us a call, okay? We've got attorneys we can turn to. We've got our own experience that we can turn to, and perhaps we can help you make a choice, make a change,